The doll collection Jack Harding owned a small antique shop in the suburbs of Chicago. The shop, called Timeless Mysteries, was nestled on a narrow street surrounded by brick buildings that seemed forgotten by time. Its display window drew attention. In the center, among old books, clocks, and candlesticks, there was always space for one or two vintage dolls. Jack had been collecting them for years. He often joked that his true calling was to be a doll maker, not an antique dealer. His collection included dozens of pieces, porcelain beauties from the Victorian era, primitive wooden figures from Europe, and everything in between. Some were in pristine condition, while others looked worn and eerie, as if they carried the weight of a tragic past. Jack had grown used to their company. The dolls didn't speak or demand attention, but filled the shop with an odd sense of presence. The shop had become his home, a sanctuary for forgotten objects and memories. The first odd observation: one evening after locking the door and preparing to close the shutters, Jack noticed that one of the dolls, a porcelain girl with long chestnut hair, had shifted from her usual spot. She always stood on the top shelf between a music box and an old telescope. Now her head was turned toward the door, as if she were watching him leave. "Must be the draft," Jack muttered under his breath. But the thought lingered. He carefully returned the doll to her place and checked the windows to ensure they were shut tight. Satisfied, he left for the night. The next morning, Jack arrived at the shop early. The doll had moved again. This time, her arms were extended toward the counter. "Someone must be playing a prank," Jack said, staring at the doll. She, of course, didn't respond. By the third day, the situation had escalated. Now, two dolls placed on different shelves had moved closer to the display window. The strangest part was that no fingerprints were left behind, no sign that anyone had entered the shop. Jack reviewed the surveillance footage again. The recording showed nothing unusual. No movement, no intruders. Yet every morning the dolls were in new positions. He tried to rationalize it, thinking that perhaps his memory was failing him. Maybe he had moved the dolls and forgotten. Maybe stress was playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. A sinister discovery. The changes became impossible to ignore when Jack noticed one of his newest acquisitions, a large wooden doll of a man in an old-fashioned suit, starting to change. When he had purchased it at an estate auction 2 months earlier, the doll had seemed unremarkable. Its features were roughly carved, the paint on its face faded with age. But now those features were becoming unnervingly detailed. The nose, once a vague bump, now had a distinct shape, one that resembled Jack's own. The same was true of the chin, the wrinkles on its forehead, even the faint scar on its left cheek. Jack froze as he stared at the doll. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing. "This can't be real," he whispered, backing away. The changes didn't stop there. The doll's wooden hands, which had been little more than crude stumps, began to take on the appearance of real hands. The fingers grew thinner, more defined. Nails appeared, followed by faint lines and creases in the skin. Jack felt as though he were losing his mind. Every day, the doll grew more lifelike and more similar to him. The legend desperate for answers, Jack turned to Carl Myers, a fellow antique collector who was well-versed in the strange and macabre. When Jack shared his concerns, Carl listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. "You've heard of soul dolls, haven't you?" Carl asked, leaning forward. Jack shook his head. "They're rare, but the legends are consistent," Carl explained. "Some dolls are said to have the ability to absorb the essence of their owners. It starts small, taking on physical traits, but eventually they go further. They take memories, personality, even life itself." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "How do I stop it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl hesitated. "Sometimes destroying the doll works," he said, "but sometimes it's too late." The nightmares. Jack's nights became restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the wooden doll staring at him, its face now a perfect replica of his own. In his dreams, the doll's mouth would move, whispering words he couldn't understand. He began to see changes in himself as well. His skin grew pale and cold, almost like porcelain. His movements felt stiff, unnatural. It was as if the life was being drained from him, piece by piece. One night, Jack dreamed that he was standing in the shop, surrounded by his dolls. They were all watching him, their glassy eyes filled with a strange awareness. "You belong with us now," one of them said in a voice that sounded eerily like his own. Jack woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The gathering. By the final week of January, Jack had reached his breaking point. The doll was no longer just a replica of him, it had become something else entirely. Its eyes were no longer wooden, they gleamed with a strange, almost human light. Its lips were soft, its hair smooth and shiny. The other dolls in the shop began to act strangely as well. They no longer simply moved during the night, now they shifted positions in front of Jack. They would turn their heads to watch him as he worked. Sometimes he heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out. One evening, Jack decided he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the wooden doll and locked it in a chest, then carried the chest to the attic. "Let's see you move now," he muttered. But the relief was short-lived. That night, he woke to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. When he opened the door to the shop, he froze in terror. The dolls had gathered around the counter. At their center stood the wooden doll, free from its chest. It was fully alive now, its face an exact copy of Jack's. "Thank you," it said, its voice calm and measured. "Thank you for giving me your life." The final transformation. The next day, Carl visited the shop, concerned about Jack's silence. When he entered, the place was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as if it were thick with unseen tension. Then he saw it. On the counter stood a new doll. It was masterfully crafted, with lifelike features that bore an uncanny resemblance to Jack. Carl stared at the doll, a sinking feeling in his chest. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed its surface, he felt a cold, unnatural pulse beneath the surface, like a heartbeat. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he backed away, and as he turned to leave, he could have sworn he heard a faint whisper, "Welcome to the collection."